Everyone realizes that environmental damage is a problem. The question is whether linking trade with the environment is really the way to solve this problem. Let's first understand a few key terms in today's debate. By trade, we're referring to the exchange of goods and services between two nations or a group of nations. We are not referring to the transfer of capital from nation to nation, such as investment. We are also not referring to the commercial activities of multinational corporations, such as building factories in countries. By environment, we recognize that there are many types of environmental damage, but we want to focus on transnational pollution in this case, because countries are more likely to link trade with the environment where this pollution crosses national boundaries and could possibly directly affect them. By keep separate, what we mean is that we will not make the environment a condition for trade or vice versa. For example, we will not impose tariffs or sanctions upon a country if the country is unable to satisfy certain environmental standards. We will also not withhold free trade agreements based on the ability of a country to meet certain environmental standards. The policy for the proposition today is as follows. The proposition today stands for a clear separation between trade and the environment. In the status quo, we look at examples such as the Kyoto Protocol, which makes no mention of trade measures to punish signatories for non-compliance. And we also see that most free trade agreements usually do not contain any clauses pertaining to the environment, such as the US-Morocco Free Trade Agreement signed in 2006. Now in the short term, the proposition could make use of alternative measures, namely diplomacy, transfer of green technologies, and developmental aid. Diplomacy in this case could refer to negotiations between governments to commit countries to being more environmentally friendly, just more in their economic activities. We see that there has been a track record of successes, such as the 2004 Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, which 151 countries have signed and ratified up to this point in time. Yes, ma'am? Now, ma'am, your assumption is that countries need an incentive to protect the environment. The fact remains that countries know that damaging the environment is going to harm their long-term developmental interests in the long term. Now, I'll explain this to you later on in my substantive. The second measure we propose today is that of transfer of green technologies. This is about the transfer of expertise on the use of green technology to help nations develop in a sustainable manner. We need to know that this is an ongoing process in the status quo. In fact, at the recent UN Climate Change Conference in Bali, the USA assured other nations that it was currently engaged in the transfer of green technologies on a massive scale. The final measure we propose today is that of developmental aid. It's about providing governments with the resources to be environmentally friendly. It's about helping nations cover the cost of adopting green technologies in certain sectors of their economies. Now in the long term, no thank you madam, the proposition will allow for the flourishing of free trade without any interference from environmental issues. Because we believe that free trade ultimately serves the long-term developmental and environmental interests of both the first and third world. The criteria for today's debate is which side of the house best helps development and the environment at the same time. The proposition today shall prove to you that keeping trade and the environment best serves the needs of development and the environment. And we shall also prove to you that linking trade and the environment is unnecessary, ineffective, and counterproductive. The opposition, on the other hand, needs to prove to us today that there are no reasons to separate trade and the environment, and that linking trade and the environment will better serve the needs of development and the environment. Before I move on, let's first clarify today that the proposition agrees that something needs to be done about the environment, but we feel that tying trade to the environment is not the way to go. So today, as the first speaker, we'll be telling you about how linking trade and the environment is counterproductive, unnecessary, and ineffective. My second speaker, on the other hand, will be telling you about the propensity for abuse by anti-free trade movements and undermining cooperation. So we ask ourselves this very simple question: what's wrong with linking trade and the environment? Three very simple reasons: counterproductive, unnecessary, and ineffective. Now it's counterproductive not just on one front, but on two fronts. On that of development and the environment. So firstly, on that of development, we need to know that when trade measures are used punitively against third world nations, the poor in the developing world are hurt the most. Because we see that a reduction in trade could mean that the pace of development of third world nations would slow down, because these nations depend heavily on trade for development. For example, in Angola alone, we see that trade with other nations contribute to approximately 90% of its GDP in 2007. This is how much trade constitutes in a third world nation's economy. And when we remove this trade, just so to punish them for not being able to satisfy certain environmental standards, the poor will suffer as a result. Because this would mean that they could lose their jobs. They will have no money to pay for their next meal, a supply of clean water, and proper sanitation. These are things basic for human survival. Yes, ma'am.
On the contrary, sir, we tell you that the poor suffering will be a further incentive for the government of such banned country to actually be more environmentally friendly and thus ensure the jobs of the poor continue.
Ma'am, you're telling me you're going to make people die just so that you can prove a point to the government that you need to develop sustainably. We on the side of the proposition feel that that is not the case. In this case, on the side of the proposition, we feel that development and trade can happen side by side, but on different paths. In other words, today, keeping trade and the environment separate could in fact help both development and the environment. Now, moving back to my substantive, on the second front of counterproductivity, environment. Trade leads to development, and development is crucial to lifting people out of poverty. We see in Indonesia alone, 78% of poor farmers are willing to slash and burn and destroy the environment in order to keep his family alive. We tell you there was a choice between starving to death within the next few days or dying from flooding due to global warming within the next few decades. People are more willing to live now and worry later about the future. We tell you that when people escape from the poverty trap, they do not have to pollute in order to survive in the long term. They will be more concerned with the long-term issue of the environment. However, if development is hindered by the lifting of trade and the environment, the people would not be lifted out of poverty, and people are now more willing to damage the environment in order to guarantee their next meal. The second reason, unnecessary. Governments all over the world recognize the importance of developing in a sustainable manner. They recognize that pollution created by unsustainable development actually hurts their citizens because the people do experience the effects of pollution firsthand. When protecting the environment does not compromise significantly on their development, we see that countries have already implemented green measures. For example, in Colombia, after achieving a healthy level of development, legislators have begun to charge factories for every unit of emission they pollute. This has not compromised Colombia's development in a significant manner while ensuring that development is sustainable. We tell you that third world nations will protect their primary resources because they are key to their economic development. We see, for example, the Amazon rainforest in Brazil is being reforested because the Brazilian government sees that this is not a way to continue exploiting the vast resources of the Amazon rainforest. But the reason why countries are not doing more is because there's a more important imperative to develop and to bring their people out of poverty. Not because they don't want to or don't know how to, but rather because they cannot. And this is also why it's ineffective. Because by lifting trade and the environment, you are tackling the presumed problem of unwillingness to develop sustainably in governments when the problem actually lies with a lack of expertise and resources to adopt a green agenda of development. Thus, I prove to you that linking trade and the environment is counterproductive because it harms both development and the environment, and necessary because governments already recognize the importance of developing sustainably. Therefore, we should keep trade and the environment separate for the sake of development and the environment. Thank you.
6 billion people, and we are affected by one common problem that threatens our very existence. According to the World Health Organization, 154,000 people die every year from the effects of global warming. Yes, we agree today that there is a problem in this world today, and we cannot stop climate change entirely, but we must try to use as many measures as possible to minimize it to ensure that our environment is sustainable for us and for future generations. And the key to this is to embrace the idea of sustainable development. And thus, the criteria of this debate will be to promote sustainable development or the achievement of a balance between economic development as well as environmental sustainability. And it is on the onus of the proposition to show that keeping trade and environment separate is necessary and justified to benefit both the environment and the economy, neither of which they have shown today. Firstly, on how, and I will deal with this to my two main rebuttals today. Firstly, on how they claim that the poor are being affected, and secondly, on how they claim that there is no necessity for us to keep trade and environment together, and hence we should keep them apart. Now, on my first point of contention, now the other side says that the poor will be affected by these sanctions. However, ladies and gentlemen, we see today that if we actually separate trade and environment, if the poor are not taken care of, they are already affected by global warming, they are already affected by the effects of global warming, such as pollution within their countries. And hence we need to keep trade and environment together, so in order to incentivize the government of the poor countries to take care of them and to pump money in. The other side claims thinks today that the government, just because the government knows that there's a problem, they won't necessarily pump money in. However, ladies and gentlemen, today this is not true, because the government in the world today, they have their own selfish motivation. They will want to keep costs down. No, thank you, sir. They will want to keep costs down. They will want to try to produce their goods in the cheapest way possible, regardless of whether or not this is environmentally friendly. And hence we need these trade and environment. We need trade to be linked to the environment so that these governments will realize the necessity for them to actually have these. No, thank you, madam. And also furthermore, they talked about how it will be the third world that is affected, but ladies and gentlemen, it's not true, because we see today that the countries that engage in trade the most are actually the first world, and hence when these are occurring, the people who are actually affected are not even the third world, but actually the first world, because even if we see that we see that in these third world countries, they're either agriculture or manufacturing. The agricultural goods are not affected by these so-called trade sanctions and all that. And the manufacturing industry is the one that will be affected by it. And these manufacturing industries are run by MNCs that come from the first world. And we see that essentially, no thank you, madam, essentially the people who are affected are from the first world and not from the third world. And hence their point on how the poor is affected entirely doesn't stand. No thank you, sir. Now we go on to my second point on how their side has claimed today that there is no need. Now their side, as I said earlier, their side thinks that just because the governments know that there is a problem, that they won't necessarily address it. However, this is not true. As I said, these governments are inherently profit motivated. They will not dare to actually try to undertake any major actions in order to try and keep their popular vote. So hence we need these incentives for them, as I will go on in my case proper, to prove. Yes, sir.
48% of China's population is involved in the manufacturing industry. Would you take away their livelihoods? Most of these people are poor.
Thank you, sir. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we see today that we are not actually taking away their livelihoods. I don't know where the proposition today has gotten the idea from. What we are going to do today is just ensure that we are going to try and put on trade sanctions to try and make them pollute less. And if these countries pollute less, for example, if China pollutes less, these 43% of people, well, they are going to benefit as well, because their air is going to be less, not exactly smoke-free, but there's going to be less smog, and this is definitely going to be beneficial to their health. And hence, ladies and gentlemen, we see today that we need to incentivize the government, and the best way to do so is through trade, as I'll prove in my case. No, thank you, sir. So, ladies and gentlemen, now that I've shown to you why the proposition today has not proven to us the need or justification for trade and environment to be separated, I will prove in my case that trade and sustainable development are closely linked, and that trade policies are absolutely essential for sustainable development. Whilst my second speaker will touch on the other benefits of not separating trade and environment. As I said so at the start, the damage, no thank you, sir, that we have done to the environment has consequences that necessitates immediate action. Global warming has contributed to the increased occurrence of natural disasters, and we see that these activities do not happen by chance. They are the result of the high demand of products that are the result of these damaging activities. And this leads me on to the first point, on the link between the trade and the environment. We've seen rapid globalization in the 20th century, and as countries open up to trade, markets expand, exports increase, and economic activity increases as a result. The increase in economic activity, of course, results in an increase in production, and this has two major effects on the environment. Firstly, the greater amount of production leads to a greater need for fuel, and hence a greater amount of carbon emissions, as well as a greater need for land and thus deforestation. And this in turn leads to the greenhouse effect, which then results in global warming. For example, external demands for soya products have led to deforestation in the Amazon, which in turn leads to an increase of 750 million tons of carbon emission a year. And this is all due to trade. And secondly, greater production also causes an increased destruction of habitats or over-harvesting, and this threatens the survival of living species as well as the delicate ecological balance. For example, according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, overfishing in Norway and Japan, due to a huge demand for exports, is threatening the supply of fish worldwide. What do you have to say to that, madam?
Are you trying to then propose that the solution is to stop all trade so that we have no more factories to pollute the environment?
No, thank you, madam. That is not what I'm trying to say. And as I will go on to mention later on in my point, I will be talking about the policies that should be taken in hand, the policies that will be undertaken when trade and environment are not separated. But now let's go back to my point. We see that overproduction not only threatens the heritage of flora and fauna, it also threatens the food security of our future generations. And this food security will eventually affect trade itself as well. And hence we see that trade and environment are something that are very closely linked. So in this increasingly globalized world, we see that production is, as I've said earlier, very much related to trade. No, thank you, sir. Hence, no policy to tackle environmental degradation can be implemented effectively and comprehensively without tackling trade. And this leads me on to my second point about why trade is the best way to deal with environmental problems. No, thank you, sir. In which I will deal with their speaker's POI, telling me about what are exactly our measures we're going to take. Now, we must understand today that all producers are profit motivated. When there is no market intervention, producers often have no incentive to pollute less. However, when trade and environment are not separated, we can provide incentives for producers to pollute less, such as by allowing them to sell their carbon permits, as well as disincentives for producers to pollute by implementing their tariffs and sanctions. No, we're not suggesting that we stop trade completely, but we're just having measures to restrict it instead. Let's look at the incentives first. In schemes such as the European Union Greenhouse Gas Emission Trading Scheme, each producer is allocated a number of carbon credits, and the total number of carbon credits allocated are 7 to 10% less than the original levels. Producers will naturally try to pollute less so that they will have leftover permits to sell. Hence, we see that by keeping trade and environment together through the trading of carbon credits, this is an incentive to producers to pollute less. Similarly, tariffs and sanctions are disincentives for them to harm the environment. For example, the USA has in 1994 banned imports of tuna caught with nets that also trap dolphins, a threatened species, and this has encouraged tuna producers such as that in Japan to change the nets that they use. Hence, I've proven to you today the need to keep trade and environment together for the sake of our future and for the sake of preserving our environment and natural heritage for the generations that are yet to come. Let this motion fall. Thank you.
Yes, the environment is a problem. That is something that the proposition never denies. But our stand remains that using trade to try to solve environmental problems is unjustified, ineffective, and ultimately going to be counterproductive. And I'm going to show it to you this in my main points of contention. But before I move on, let me first clarify what exactly it means to tie trade and the environment together. Now, we haven't really heard what the opposition's opinion on this is, and I believe the motion does call them for us to at least clarify their stand on what they mean by wanting to tie the trade and environment. We've given you several suggestions such as sanctions, tariffs, or withholding free trade agreements, and if they don't respond to their next speaker, we assume that is what they go with. But more than that, they seem to hint in their substantive that this also includes carbon trading. However, as the proposition, we want to clarify today that this should be out of the debate because, as we've defined, trade is the exchange of economic goods between nations, and tying trade to the environment means using trade as a means to try and effect change in countries, and hence carbon trading shouldn't be part of this debate. So thank you. And so, let me move on to my two main points of contention. Firstly, whether the interests of the people in the third world are hurt, and secondly, who best achieves environmental protection. So first, whether the interests of the third world people are hurt. Now you can't say that the third world people won't be affected, and their main line of logic is because the third world people are not in the manufacturing industry, and thus they won't be hurt. However, this is not true because firstly, many people, as my third speaker has pointed out in his POI, are dependent on the manufacturing industry for their jobs. And more than that, it's an assumption to say people in agriculture don't depend on free trade because they need markets as well to sell their goods. Free trade allows them to have external markets to sell their goods. And undoubtedly, if you are going to undermine trade, and my first speaker has put forth to you, you are going to harm the third world people because they are dependent on trade. And so having shown you how the third world people are going to be harmed, let's move on to the next and more important question about who best achieves environmental protection. On the first tier, we told you it's unnecessary because third world countries have their own internal incentive to solve the problem of the environment. What did they say to that? They say that countries have their selfish motivation and they want to produce goods at the cheapest cost. However, we have to keep in mind today that part of this selfish motivation is to preserve the environment. And why is this so? No third world person would like to have smoke in their eyes, ladies and gentlemen. Preserving the environment, preventing localized pollution is also part of the vested interest of the third world government. And hence, they will do all they can. Hang on a minute, madam. I give you the example of Brazil, where they have a $10 billion campaign to try to convert their energy use to ethanol. We see clear will without any trade pressure from countries to actually do something. Yes, madam.
On the contrary, madam, the problem is that the government feels that it's necessary to achieve profit first to protect the environment, and therefore, in the meanwhile, while they follow your stance, the people are suffering due to the pollution, because the day when they clean up never ever comes, and we need to incentivize them to do so by trade.
Madam, that is not true. I've given you examples. My first speaker has given you examples of countries who are interested in who have an interest in protecting the environment, and perhaps we do concede that the third world may not be able to meet to the high and lofty standards they set up. But let me give you the reason why now. It's because they have two imperatives. The first imperative, the environment, and the second imperative, poverty alleviation. And when they balance this, they find the right balance, and we don't have to pressure them anymore. And as a result, we put forth to you today that using trade is also going to be ineffective because it pressures governments and it presupposes the problem is the lack of will, when in actuality the problem is a lack of capability. And finally, on the point of it being counterproductive, my first speaker has put forth to you the point about how people being uplifted from poverty will ultimately allow environmental protection to take place in a better way. And they haven't dealt with this, so I asked the next speaker to actually come up. And so, having proven to you how we better achieve environmental protection, let me move on to my substantives on the propensity for abuse by anti-free trade movements. In an era of globalization, free trade is important both to the global economy as well as the development of the third world. International trade makes up 55%, hang on a minute, 55% of the world's GDP and 38% of the developing world's GDP. It thus is vital to the welfare of billions.
Actually, madam, are you aware of the fact that free trade benefits the first world and not the third world, because the third world doesn't get to make money on taxation on imports and exports?
Madam, that is not true. We say today that precisely because free trade is so important, we have laws against protectionism, which have been put in place to ensure the free flow of trade. And in fact, the third world does benefit from having external markets to sell their goods. And what happens is that if you don't separate the trade environment, all the problems you've mentioned will come about, because anti-free trade lobbies can then use the environment as an excuse to circumvent international law which preserves free trade and implement protectionist measures. An example of this would be in 1992, when the United States passed the law banning the import of shrimps from countries who did not use appropriate measures to protect sea turtles. In reality, this was a measure aimed at appeasing their local shrimp industry. And what happened was that this was only overturned by the World Trade Organization 7 years later, after the damage was done. Hence, such protectionism was only made possible because of the link between the trade and environment, and this leads to tangible consequences. Firstly, it hinders economic development worldwide, as countries are dependent on free trade for external markets to sell their goods. And furthermore, a cycle of protectionism might arise because other countries will take retaliatory measures against countries who impose sanctions on them. Not only will this harm consumers and producers in the first and the third world alike, this will also worsen relations between countries, which brings me on nicely to my next point on undermining cooperation. We have to recognize today that environmental issues are both local and transnational. Carbon dioxide thrown up by gas flares in Nigeria not only hurt the local population but also contribute to the problem of global warming, and hence such global environmental problems require a global solution which is based on international cooperation. Linking trade to the environment via punitive trade measures such as sanctions, tariffs, or withholding of free trade only serve to undermine such cooperation, because such measures, are seen as antagonistic by those on the receiving end. Given that the first world has been the big culprits of environmental degradation and have polluted for development, the imposition of high environmental standards using trade will only be seen as hypocritical and imperialistic. And even if ultimately sanctions are not imposed, or even if they are genuinely motivated by environmental concerns, the perceived threat to economic well-being will also hurt relationships between countries. It negatively affects the attitudes of the third world toward the environment because they now view it as a first world problem being unfairly imposed on them. This might lead to them not even being willing to come to the negotiating table and discuss any environmental issues. But more importantly, it alienates the people. The people today play an integral role in environmental protection. Many environmental problems take root from society, the lack of awareness on an individual level. And so, for example, slash and burn techniques would be more effectively dealt with if only we had the cooperation of the farmer in the countries. And hence, putting environment as a prerequisite for trade will only serve to stir resentment amongst the population and deny us this cooperation we so badly need. And hence, because I've shown you that joining the trade and environment will lose us cooperation and would cause anti-free trade measures to come about, that this motion must stand. all, when you put them side by side, it can therefore be told that obviously trade is important to a country. Then my question is, how then do we make countries actually implement more environmentally friendly methods or measures in their country? We see that we do it through the route of trade. And how so? The question is, on what methods are we talking about? We're talking about trade sanctions, trade restrictions. And on top of that, we don't see why carbon trading should actually be excluded from this debate, because we see that carbon trading, although it's not the trading of goods, but it's a policy implemented with regards to trade. So we don't see why it should be actually excluded from this debate. Now, having dealt with that, so are we looking at, first of all, their policy? Secondly, I'll look at the idea of how trade sanctions fail, or rather our policy fails. Thirdly, I'll look at how free trade, the importance of free trade. And finally, I'll look at how the cooperation is undermined when we actually have trade sanctions. Okay, so let's look at the policy. So today they have told how the alternate policy, if they remove this idea of trade sanctions, is actually to have green technology being transferred into third world nations per se. So my question then is, who does it? Why is there an incentive for countries to actually transfer green technology into other countries or third world for that matter? We see that we don't actually give countries an impetus to do that. We don't see a reason why would USA suddenly stand up and give China more green technology? There's no reason. And furthermore, green technology is so expensive that countries wouldn't even want to do that because their products become more expensive. And we tell you that when we include trade sanctions into environment, rather when we involve trade and environment together, my case today, I'll prove to you how essentially green technology then becomes cheaper. And this is why, when it becomes cheaper, more countries actually use it. And furthermore, we put forth that ultimately, even if their policy is effective, it's not mutually exclusive to their side. We are just saying, what we put forth is that we can also adopt their policies if it is so effective. But we put forth, we don't see why is it so bad to remove trade from the environment. Now to my next rebuttal. No, thank you, ma'am. We look at how Alright, so we see today that ultimately they put forth that trade sanctions have failed because of third world nations, how third world nations will eventually suffer. Then we put forth that who actually are we targeting when we target third world nations? We are targeting MNCs, who actually operate as manufacturing companies, thank you, sir. In MNCs, we tell you it's actually in third world nations, it's actually the MNCs. And we want MNCs to cut down, and we tell you that MNCs are rich and capable enough to cut down. And we put forth that the poor, thank you, ma'am, we put forth that the poor in these third world nations will not actually suffer, because ultimately MNCs will find a way to cut down on their pollution and will still want to stay in their country because of the resources there, so the jobs will not be lost. And then, of course, we must put forth that furthermore, when you have trade sanctions, the ultimate target we want is the first world nations. We tell you that first world nations and developing nations, we want to target them because they can afford to cut down. They should be cutting down, we put forth. And on top of that, we tell you that because of them, because of all the carbon emissions that they have, we tell you that they are actually affecting third world nations. South Africa is suffering because their agricultural production has gone down simply because of climate change. And we tell you this is something that is caused by many different countries. No, thank you, sir. Now then, let's look at my next point on how free trade is important. Now, we just like to touch on this point and tell you that free trade here, they've not actually told us why is it so important. In fact, we tell you that third world nations don't actually want free trade. Why? Because we see that when third world nations are able to tax on imports that come into their country, they actually gain tax. They actually gain money that can actually fuel the progress in their country. So we don't see why it's so important to them. And then, having lightly dealt with that point, I'll finally look at how cooperation will be undermined. Now, ladies and gentlemen, cooperation of countries coming together, has it happened? Yes. But why did it happen? It's because of the fact that there are carbon credits right now. It's because of the fact that there are trade sanctions and trade barriers being in place. So now we see that countries actually have an incentive to come together and meet up and share their policies. Let me give you a good example, like the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. These countries, USA, UK, the European Union, they actually come together and they have actually discussed policies on how best to protect the environment. So ladies and gentlemen, we really don't see one more minute. We really don't see why you shouldn't include trade and environment together, because we tell you that because of the fact that we put them together, countries are actually now cooperating with each other, and we don't see how your policy actually ensures that they will do so without the use of trade. Yes, ma'am. No one will would want to target countries like China or USA who are similarly the biggest polluters because no one...
Alright then, thank you very much. Yes, we see that this is what you assert and this is what you say, that countries don't want to target USA and China. But I put forth to you that recently the European Union have actually held a meeting and decided that they're going to engage China and engage US to cut down their carbon emission. But they are not ruling out putting sanctions on US and China, meaning that they're actually considering it. So we don't see why countries are not willing to do it. We tell you countries are actually very willing to do it. Because at the end of the day, if the environment is not protected, they suffer. Now, having dealt with that, I'll nicely move on to my case for today. So we look at my case. Now, I'll be proving how the use of trade policies can lead to greater accessibility of green technology. Now, how so? Now, as my first speaker has already proven to you that trade policies actually provide monetary incentives for countries to actually adopt environmentally friendly measures. So we see that this means that countries now have an incentive to invest in green technology and also encourage the use of it. So at the same time, we see that governments, we see that governments will then have the incentive to also introduce environmentally friendly policies such as the ecological tax in Germany, where they tax companies which overpollute. Yes, sir.
If you say that trade can bring money, why wouldn't the third world want trade? In other words, why are you telling us?
Alright, I tell you that the trade wants money, but what's the problem with the third world? The world is not developed enough, meaning that they don't, unlike the stronghold of trade, they don't have a strong footing in trade at the moment. You see that first world nations are beating them to it. First world nations had the upper hand in developing their trade. So therefore we see that right now, although trade is good to every country, the third world nations are suffering because of the first world nations. Now back to my case. So as a result, we see that profit-motivated firms have monetary incentive to actually purchase green technologies such as scrubbers to reduce their carbon emissions. So ultimately, countries and firms will then gain environmentally and monetarily when they actually cut down on their carbon emissions. So this then translates into demand for green technology. So when countries actually spend more on green technology or invest in more research and development in green technologies, we tell you that cheaper and more accessible green technologies can then be produced. So ultimately, let me give you an example. We see that, for example, ever since the carbon caps were implemented in the year 2000, there's companies actually had an incentive to invest in this technology like General Electric. They've invested $1.5 billion in not only buying more green technology, but also investing in research and technology. And now we see that they have actually invested in this research, the photovoltaic cells, which convert solar energy into electricity. And back in the 1970s, it was actually $20, and now it's $2.70. So we see that green technology is becoming cheaper. And when it becomes cheaper, ultimately countries will then have an incentive to use it. So therefore, at the end of the day, because of this incentive, because of this benefit, let us not keep trade and environment separate. Thank you.
Every year, 11 million children die before they reach their 5th birthday. They die of causes like hunger, of diseases, and abject poverty. But these people don't need to die. They can be saved by things like trade. Trade, which brings in jobs that provides for income so they can put food on the table. Trade that provides for investment into infrastructure, like healthcare, like education, so they can break out of the poverty cycle. And now the opposition today proposes to us that they use a whole gamut of trade sanctions to remove trade from these countries so that the poor cannot be saved. We tell you this is morally reprehensible. And today, let's keep this in mind as we move on to the 3 questions that we have for today. Is there necessarily a need to tie trade and environment together? Secondly, will tying trade and environment together be effective? And lastly, will it be counterproductive? Let's first deal with the entire issue of justification. Now, my first speaker came up here and told all of us today that yes, saving the environment is important. But what we need to realize today is that tying trade to the environment is unnecessary because countries are already doing all they can in terms of limiting pollution. Where pollution doesn't affect when protecting the environment doesn't compromise significantly on the development, as he has told you today, countries already implement many green measures. We look at countries like China and its recent efforts to set up eco-city. We look at Indonesia and Brazil and their reforestation programs, and we say the reason, the problem that we see today is actually not a lack of incentive, but a lack of capability. Countries realize that localized pollution hurts their own citizens as well. They realize that there are economic detriments to be brought about from pollution. Okay? Things like healthcare costs, for instance. Let me give you the example of the Brazilian rainforest. 1 hectare of Amazon rainforest, for instance, is worth $6,000 if it's harvested sustainably, compared to 100 if it's deforested right away. Now, governments realize that it's important for them to protect the environment, so whenever it's possible, they do so. And now the reason why countries like third world nations are doing more to limit environmental damage is because there is an imperative for them to develop. There is an imperative for them to bring their people out of poverty. There's an imperative for them to save lives now, to save lives today. This is an imperative which third world nations would not be willing to compromise whatsoever. It's an imperative that wouldn't disappear if you use things like trade sanctions, use things like carbon trading programs, because the need for third world nations to develop is simply too urgent. Now, the right step for us to take is to ensure that they can fulfill this imperative to develop in the most environmentally friendly manner possible. My first speaker provided you with a number of alternatives like diplomacy and developmental aid, which have been shown to work. Now, they told us today that this is not mutually exclusive to what they're doing. But like my second speaker has pointed out to you, it's actually counterproductive to efforts like diplomacy and developmental aid. This is because trade sanctions are open to things like protectionism and abuse. Trade sanctions cause countries to be antagonistic towards each other, and thus they won't be open to things like diplomacy. Now, having shown you very clearly that there's no necessity for us to tie trade together with the environment, let's move on to the second point on effectiveness. Now, they haven't set up very clearly what the exact range of options they're going to pursue in order to ensure that the environment will be safe. They've offered us an entire gamut, no thank you ma'am, things like carbon trading, trade sanctions, and targeting MNCs. Now, firstly, let's deal with carbon trading. Now, telling you today that carbon trading doesn't really help the environment. It isn't really a cap. It merely allows nations to continue polluting, because the more polluted countries can simply pollute by purchasing more permits from countries which pollute less. And we see today that carbon trading really isn't the solution. Now, the second idea of trade sanctions, they haven't really dealt with us on the entire issue of how my first and second speaker brought to us how it's counterproductive, and lastly on the entire issue of MNCs. Now, my first speaker in his first minute clarified MNCs out of debate. Why so? Because things like trade sanctions directly affect governments. They're meant to pressure governments into doing things, and that's why we say MNCs. Let's save that topic for another debate. Now, let's talk about how they're going to target only the first world. But we realize today that it's necessary for us to target the third world if we want to achieve anything as well. We say look at China, which is a third world country, which is the largest emitter of carbon dioxide today. I don't leave it alone, seriously. And the reason why they haven't been targeting third world nations is simply because they realize as we do today that it's impossible to target these nations simply because it's not a matter of incentive but a matter of inability. So they told us today they will target the first world nations. But I tell you today that it's actually unfeasible. It's unfeasible and will not happen. No one will sanction these nations in the first place because they make up a large portion of their own economies, and it will be too punitive to the person who's actually withholding trade. We look at China-US trade, which amounts to 21% of the economy between two nations. We look at Nigeria, hold on a moment, sir. Nigeria-US trade, which accounts for 48.9%. Hold on a minute, man. Which accounts for 48.9% of the economy within Nigeria. Do you seriously think that Nigeria would sanction the United States, which is one of the largest polluters today, simply in order for them to enforce environmental regulations? Yes, ma'am.
So we see today there are countries that are bigger than the United States, countries such as the EU that will do so, who would actually impose such tariffs, and we're not exactly suggesting such.
No, thank you, ma'am. Now let's look at this very carefully. It's true that I threatened the use of trade sanctions, but having really seen first world nations executing trade sanctions against other first world nations, we haven't seen them done so. Why so? Because we realize that it's ineffective. It's going to be punitive to the person who actually executes these sanctions. We realize that many of these nations today, the largest polluters are also the biggest traders in the world today, and they have a large range of options to pursue. They can trade with any number of other trading partners, and inevitably, a policy of trade sanctions will be ineffective. So having dealt with an effectiveness point, let's deal with the entire issue of counterproductive. I'll prove to you today that it's counterproductive both to alleviating poverty and towards the aims of development, and also be counterproductive to the entire issue of the environment. Now, my first speaker told you that free trade helps alleviating poverty in the short term. Hundreds of millions of people in China and India were brought out of abject poverty, partly because of trade. Hold on a minute, ma'am. And these jobs were created by manufacturing products that are exported overseas. And these shops provide for food, clothing, and shelter for the poor. Yes, ma'am. I beg to differ, ma'am. All these products which Chinese are manufacturing actually allow them a source of income because first world nations are purchasing these cheaper products. Consumers want to purchase the cheapest products, and inevitably, poor nations would benefit from trade. Now, let's move on to the second point on how trade actually helps poverty in the long term. We see trade brings in the capital that is required to build infrastructure, like hospitals and schools, as I earlier elaborated. Now, we also see that trade is actually counterproductive. Because such a policy can be used to justify things like protectionism, like my second speaker has outlined to you. When you have things like protectionism that limit trade, we are inadvertently going to detriment the poor who are unable to benefit from things like from development. And lastly, they have told us an entire idea of how it actually hurts, global warming actually hurts the poor. But what is the point, ladies and gentlemen, of saving these people 20 years later from lung cancer when in 3 days' time they will die from starvation? Now, in order to holistically take care of the poor, let's entertain the possibility proposed by some that global warming would at best be delayed by their trade section. What happens is that by removing trade and consequently development, you're preventing the world nations from having the financial capability and the infrastructure to protect their citizens, from protecting them by shifting the higher ground, for instance, by protecting them by building seawalls. And lastly, let's talk about the entire issue of how it's counterproductive to the environment. Now, firstly, we say that the prerequisite for these countries to go green in the first place is development, so they can invest in things like green technology. We say that uplifting them from poverty generates concern for the environment, because inevitably, when they reach the middle class, they gain a consciousness, and they are more concerned about their more immediate concerns, and now we'll move on to long term, think about the mid-term, where pollution can actually affect them in the long run. And this is the reason, as I first elaborated, that a growing green consciousness will actually help poverty in the long run, and we need development for that. So for the sake of these 11 million children which die every year, we say go with side of the proposition which shows you that can benefit both trade and the environment. Thank you.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, I'm quite surprised to hear a plea for the poor from the proposition. Because right now, ladies and gentlemen, we put forth to you that a study done in 2003 by the National Geographic proved that 17.1% of people in China die every year due to smog. And I'm quite certain, ladies and gentlemen, that at least some of these 17.1 people are the poor who are killed because they refuse to do anything about the environment. And these are the poor who they are actually telling us are dying. But they're not dying for the reasons of no money, ladies and gentlemen. They're dying because the environment has been so bad, nothing's being done about it, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is killing them. And this is what this debate is about today. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's take an entire look at, firstly, the contention on the idea of carbon credits, which my side has brought to this debate, that I feel a need to clear up. And the fact is, ladies and gentlemen, that carbon credits are, after all, a commodity. And what they are basically, ladies and gentlemen, is that they're being traded between countries as a measure to control environmental problems. And thus, we don't see why they don't count as a commodity being traded by trade, and thus as a policy we may thereby contemplate in this debate. And now that we've settled that, ladies and gentlemen, basically, I have 3 main points of contention today. Firstly, no thank you, sir, on the idea of counterproductivity. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, on the idea of the importance of free trade. And lastly, ladies and gentlemen, on the idea of how our paradigm would undermine cooperation, which I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, it does not. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, to deal with this in order, but before I continue, I would like to clarify a very important point in this debate, and that is this. Side proposition has clearly thereby restricted themselves from using trade policies. My side has no objection to using certain policies not directly linked to trade if it should benefit. But above all, what we say is this, and there are certain unique circumstances under which we believe that certain recalcitrant countries need an incentive because they are profit motivated to actually take care of the environment. And doing it, their trade, is a monetary incentive that would thereby incentivize them to take care of the environment. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, now that, thank you, sir, now that I've dealt with that today, let's look at my first point of contention, that on counterproductivity. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have 2 main fears. Firstly, on the welfare of the poor, thank you, sir, and secondly, the idea of carbon credits. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as I've already told you earlier, the poor are already, in fact, suffering from the results of pollution. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, let's take an entire look at which policy does better take care of the poor. Is that point, madam? No, thank you, madam. What their entire argument assumes that trade barriers and sanctions against a country will affect the entire country as a whole. That means all other industries will drop to a standstill. Every single poor person in the country will be down from the industries, and this will have a very, very painful effect on the country, and the poor will therefore suffer and die in great huge floods. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, will they? No, thank you, sir. The point is that this is a thing painful enough to hurt the country because they are profit motivated. But at the end of the day, what my side has tried to come up in this debate and say is that although both sides agree that the environment is the problem right now, what we feel is that there's a need to prioritize environment over trade because the poor are hurting and are dying from the environment straight away. And we believe that therefore, ladies and gentlemen, this is justification enough to implement trade sanctions on the country. And furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we will prove to you the trade sanctions and the trade barrier that humanity would in fact incentivize the profit-motivated government of the country to take care of the poor by therefore helping to improve the environment. And I would like to remind the entire House, ladies and gentlemen, that this is something that the governments are clearly not doing.
Point.
No, thank you, sir. What we would in fact bring now, ladies and gentlemen, is that we would take our policy and contrast it to theirs. And what does their policy do? The problem, ladies and gentlemen, is that their policy is based on few assumptions. First of their regulation, madam, is that these, no, thank you, madam, is that these countries' governments would actually care for their people. Is this happening? No. The fact is, I've given you examples of China, ladies and gentlemen, members of this house, whereby what we see is that the Chinese government are clearly not doing anything about pollution, despite China having evolved from a third world country to at least something that is one of the world's 5 top economic superpowers. Is the Chinese government yet doing anything about the environment? And no, it is not. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that using trade as an incentive is so important because we need to make artist profit motivation factor, no, thank you, sir. And in fact, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that the second part of their policy is also based on another assumption that in the first place, once countries actually reach a certain status of development, they will care about the environment. I just show you the example of China, ladies and gentlemen. And is this necessarily true? The fact is, no, the countries will simply try and want to make more profit. Well, just because they already have a certain amount of money doesn't mean they're not going to stop wanting more. Doesn't mean they're not going to want to stop hurting the environment and suddenly want to become environmentally friendly the moment they actually reach a certain stage of development. And then the second question we must therefore ask, ladies and gentlemen, is this. And that's that even if they do, even if we were to somehow assume that countries would do so, is it too late, ladies and gentlemen? Because the fact is that the environment is an entire fragile system. The entire environment, ladies and gentlemen, can be seen as having a certain carrying capacity. The moment we upset this carrying capacity by polluting too much, polluting too much, no, thank you, sir, environmental degradation, what happens? The fact is, it is too late and it's very hard for us to recoup the damage done. Let's give an example of hypothetical example of Brazil, ladies and gentlemen. What happens if Brazil were to cut down the entire Amazon in order to become a first world country? Does this mean that Brazil can thereby replace the damage done by its excess logging in a way that can even be replaceable and that the damage can actually be checked acceptably enough, not to provide immense damage to the people, no, thank you, sir, by the removal of carbon, as we know how forests are important? The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, it can't. And that is what my side of the house tells you today, which is why the entire policy needs this element of compulsion, which is only present when we use trade-side policy, and that is why their paradigm fails, ladies and gentlemen. And let's take an entire look at the entire idea of how, no, thank you, sir, they believe that green technology will go into those countries, and the fact is they won't. Let's take a look first, ladies and gentlemen, and that the fact that there is no incentive for green technology to be developed. Why is that so? This is because most countries prefer to be profit motivated and therefore would rather go for technologies, thank you, sir, which thereby improve production and have higher productivity. Why would they want to develop green technology? And even if they would, why would it be thereby available to the third world at a cheap cost? Why would it even in the first place? If the first world has to purchase it, then it's unfeasible because the third world doesn't have the resources. And even if we were to assume that the first world will give it to the third world free, can the first world either afford to give away such technology free? And the fact is they can't. Yes, sir.
The assumption of your entire case is that countries are somehow profit motivated, but they are not. They have a duty of care. MNCs are the ones who are profit motivated.
Thank you, sir. But the point is, ladies and gentlemen, I want to ask again and again, if countries are really not profit motivated, why have there been 18 heat waves in the past in India caused by global warming? Why is it that the people in China have been dying from smoke? And why is it that smoke levels in China were so high that the Olympic Games was nearly considered not to be held there? The fact is, it is very clear that the government is not doing something. And if the government is not doing something, that being that the idea that a healthy environment would be beneficial for the people, we must thereby assume that the government feels that profit is more important than the people. And now that we've settled that, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to remind you that they have not dealt with my second speaker's point, that green technology will be better available, more affordable, due to trade-based policy. And this brings me on to my belated second point of potential, ladies and gentlemen, on the importance of free trade. I've already pointed out in a few one that the people, ladies and gentlemen, the third world, are the ones who actually get the money from free trade in the first place, from taxation and trade in the first place. They are the ones, ladies and gentlemen, who make taxation, who get money from the taxation on imports and exports. And why is this so? And why is it, ladies and gentlemen, further on, they tell us that the idea that the environment will be used as an excuse for protectionism, and they expect us to believe that this is necessarily a bad thing. Is it, ladies and gentlemen? Consider the fact that half the time, third world goods find it hard to compete with those in the first world. Half the time, industries in the third world don't have the time or the money to develop. And the fact, therefore, what we see, ladies and gentlemen, is that by protectionism, the third world benefits because their industries get to develop, get to be stronger, and thereby they get to protect the environment in our policy as well as develop a stronger industry. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we are proud to oppose.
opposition today wanted us to prove that there are no reasons for us to separate the trade and environment, which our side has done so, by showing you how trade and environment are interlinked and hence should be dealt with together, as well as the benefits that are accrued from this. Well, their side has not come up to us and shown us the necessity or justification, which I will show through my reply speech today. Now, firstly, I came out today and I talked about the need for us to keep trade and environment together, owing to the fact that these two are interlinked and they affect each other, something which their side never ever came back to. Hence, we assume that this stands and that there is a link between trade and environment, and because of this link, we have to keep them together, we have to deal with them together because of the benefits that are accrued from it, which I will want to mention. Now, but before that, let's look at their policy first. Now, their side today is kind of a policy of somehow, instead of having policies like ours, such as sanctions and tariffs that include elements of the environment, their side would rather go through green technology as well as diplomacy. But ladies and gentlemen, as our side has told you many times today, their policy can't really stand because there is no incentive for people to do so. There is no incentive for countries to have green tech. There is no incentive for them to do this unless we keep trade and environment together, unless we have trade as part of one of the options. Because we have to give them a disincentive or an incentive, because trade is so important that once something affects trade, once you have a policy that affects trade, necessarily the governments will actually realize the importance of the environment. Let's look at green technology. Now, green technology is something that's very expensive, and hence countries, even though they realize that there's a need to use it, they might not. Therefore, there's a need for us to have these policies which will essentially force them to use such green technology, or rather encourage them more to use this green technology. And hence we see that when you keep trade and environment together, what happens is that these countries, we see that it becomes more beneficial and that you can actually utilize the green technology. Let's look at their second area, let's look at their second alternative, which was on diplomacy. Now, diplomacy is useless without any impetus, as I mentioned earlier, and hence we actually need to include environment in these trade policies. Furthermore, their side seems to think that diplomacy will be harmed when we keep trade and environment together, which my second speaker has already disproved. Because the truth is that because trade and environment are kept together, it's something that countries can come together and discuss on, and hence we're actually encouraging more interaction between these countries as they come together to try and find out what are the best ways to fight pollution. Because we have attacked trade, these countries are sitting up to listen. So now let me go on to my next point on the benefits that are accrued from this, which our side has been pushing for the entire debate, namely incentives and disincentives. Incentives on the point of carbon credits, which the third speaker didn't come back to. So that point still stands, and hence we see today that carbon credits are something that can truly encourage producers to pollute less. Because what happens is that these producers will try to pollute less in order to have more carbon credits left over so they can sell it. And also we see that there are disincentives for producers where we impose tariffs on their products. And this disincentive for producers is that because these products will become more expensive by the imposition of these tariffs, what happens is that these producers will try to pollute less. And by trying to pollute less, they will utilize the green technology. As my second speaker has brought up, and as I brought up earlier, on how green technology will truly be used only if we actually keep trade and environment together. And their side claims today that these incentives and disincentives affect the third world which we can't harm. But ladies and gentlemen, that's not true. My side has shown to you today already that the third world is not harmed. Their livelihoods are not affected. What happens is that they are already going through a lot of environmental problems there. And by improving their environment, by improving the land that they live in, and this is something that is truly beneficial. We're not taking away their jobs, but rather we're giving them a healthier environment to live in. And hence, ladies and gentlemen, let's keep trade and environment together and let's not separate them. Thank you.
Now let me start off my reply speech by pointing out firstly that the opposition today hasn't done their job. They haven't engaged us. They haven't listened to us. In my first minute, I clarified amenities outside of today's debate, and yet they still bring up throughout all three speakers. And finally, they brought in new material in their third speaker and in their reply speech. They all of a sudden decided to launch late policy attacks on our policy today. But let me just first re-establish the conceptual framework for our side of the house today. Essentially, our side of the house today strives to prove to you that we need to keep trade and environment separate because the range of options which link trade with the environment is simply too damaging. And this is what we've proven to you consistently from all three speakers. And this is what the other side of the house has failed to engage us on today. So there are three main areas of clash in today's debate. Firstly on that, is it justified? Is it effective? And finally, is it counterproductive? So firstly on that of justification. The proposition came out and justified to you why we should pursue trade and the environment separately. Because by doing so, we are better able to serve the interests of trade and environment. Then what did the opposition come out and say? They came out and said, and they told us this, that they are willing to kill some people now, so that they can save them in 20 years' time. Like my second speaker pointed out, what is the point of saving these people from the effects of global warming in 20 years' time when they are going to die from starvation within the next 3 days? And the opposition has failed to come out and respond to us. And on the other hand, they came out and told us about how trade and the environment are interlinked. But so what? So what if they are interlinked? That doesn't prove to us anything. That doesn't prove to us that we should continue to keep them together. What it simply means is that we need to put in more effort to keep them separate, as my side of the house has proven to you that they are detrimental if kept together. And then they came out and gave us this logic that somehow free trade is not important. But if free trade is not important, then how exactly does the other side of the house hope to achieve anything by linking trade to the environment? If trade is not important to the third world, then what's the point of sanctioning these third world nations if trade is not important to them at all? And finally, it will be interesting to note that while outside of the house have given you examples from Angola, from Brazil, from Indonesia, the opposition on the other hand has failed to ground today's debate in reality, and the proposition today is better able to justify their case because we have shown you consistent examples. Moving on to the second area of clash on the ineffectiveness. Now, the proposition has pointed out, and this is the underlying logic of our case today, that the problem with countries not willing to implement green measures is not because they are unwilling, but because they don't know how to, because they don't have the resources to do so. And the opposition, on the other hand, they still stick very tenaciously by assuming that the problem is unwillingness. What we show to you, when implementing green measures does not significantly compromise upon development, countries have already done so. We see, for example, in China, in Brazil, in Indonesia. These are examples we provide to you, and the opposition has failed to engage us on this count. And somehow they came up with this assumption that somehow countries are profit motivated. But like I pointed out in my POI, countries are not profit motivated. It's MNCs which are profit motivated. And in this case, countries have a duty of care to their people, to save their lives, to bring them out of poverty, to develop faster, so that these people won't have to die because of things like poor water supply, like a lack of food, a lack of healthcare infrastructure. Moving on to the final area of clash on the counterproductivity. The proposition gave you 4 reasons why linking trade and environment will be counterproductive. Firstly, because it harms the environment. Secondly, because it harms development. And finally, that it protects protectionism and undermines cooperation. And what is the opposition came out to tell us about? It talks about carbon trading. Now, it will be interesting to note that their third speaker considered that carbon trading is a trade measure, not one that links trade and the environment. This is what I remember her saying. She said that it's a trading of commodity. In other words, this is not the linking of trade and the environment. And in any case, they have failed to prove to us and failed to deal with all our points on counterproductivity. Therefore, for the sake of development and the environment, go with the side of the proposition. Keep trade and the environment separate. Thank you.
Very detailed level of analysis in their context. The best individual speaker in this debate was the second speaker from Hwa-Chong, Jamie Huff. Decided that the winners of this grand final and the champions of the Ministry of Education Invitational Debating Championships 2008 is the team from Hwa-Chong.
Thank you, sir, for your summation. Let us now invite our guest of honor.